who's lost their job to a worker overseas. So is this view of
Or
free trade?
Alaska, by the way, where I used to work in the fishing industry, and it would be great if people would buy Alaskan salmon instead of Norwegian salmon in a lot of ways, at least according to an Alaska fisherman who voted for Trump, you know?
Well, so is this view of free trade, is this like a kind of elitism?
So do you think he would have been more persuasive if he was talking about a dinner plate that would appeal to a wider range of Americans? Or is it he not looking, or is it he,
it's just like unconvincing, you know? I mean, like, why would
I guess he
anybody?
couldn't fake it.
Like if you were like, I got my steak from Japan, I
Like,
got
yeah,
my
But this is the
potatoes.
point. Like, globalization is good for the elites. It's good for us. It's good for the cities.
Hello, and welcome to the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. Hello, and welcome to the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue. I'm Whitney Ganeshananthan, also known as
Lieutenant.
And
I'm Whitney, Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
So, Whit, I'm wondering what the grocery store looks like in Missouri. So, Whit, I'm wondering what the I'm kind of thinking I should
that's
stop.
really going to happen. I mean,
I'm
when
trying
the
to when
China
the
tariffs were
China
at
tariffs were at 145% or whatever, that seemed for sure a problem. I mean, he has recently lowered them. On the other hand,
I went to the
I went to the grocery store yesterday and like most stuff was there, but like I went down the China tariffs were at 145% or whatever. That seemed for sure a problem. I mean, a bunch of empty spaces, all the crackers were missing, and there was a bunch of stuff missing in CVS as well. So I can't really tell what's going to happen, but I still think the tariffs.
So, this is going to be as bad as everyone keeps saying it is. Then they came for the cookie.
Exactly, but I haven't had a chance to
I was trying to figure out.
But I mean, it could cause a real problem.
It could cause a real problem.
About, however, is the Democrats are
The problem that I am worried about, however, is the Democrats are doing a terrible job of talking about tariffs. I think the way they're critiquing them is bad. The problem that I am worried about, however, is that and they're not acknowledging that Trump's like the only politician who talks about the devastation that's gone on in smaller rural towns in the Midwest and South for the past smaller rural towns in the Midwest and South for the past 20 years. I mean, he has a real issue there.
So, voters in these places have been angry for a pretty long time about jobs. He's really making them feel heard, which the Democratic Party is definitely not doing. I mean, and also,
Joe Biden.
Joe
Biden's
Biden.
Inflation Reduction Act actually
Joe
brought
Biden's
some
Inflation
a
Reduction Act actually brought some a lot of manufacturing jobs back to the Midwest and South, and he used tariffs to do it, coupled with good industrial policy encouraging, Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act actually brought some a lot of manufacturing jobs back to the Midwest and South.
Okay, you're very persuasive, but I'm going to need another take on this. So today we've invited Julia Elliott to return to the show to talk about how Democrats talk about the economy and tariffs to voters in small towns in the middle of the U.S. Julia's story collection, Hellions, came out in April. She's also the author of the story collection, The Wilds, a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, as well as the novel The New and Improved Romy Futch, both from Tin House. Her work has appeared in the Georgia Review, Tin House, Conjunctions, Granta, and the New York Times. She has won a Rona Jaffe Writers Award, and her stories have been anthologized in Best American Short Stories, as well as Pushcart Prize, Best of the Small Presses. She teaches English and Women's and Gender Studies at the University of South Carolina and lives in Columbia with her husband, daughter, and 5 pets. Julia, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be back on. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for joining us. Okay, so we were just talking about Trump's tariff policy, which most of America has been talking about for a while. Even though he recently made a bunch of changes and backed off on his China stuff, all that stuff. We'll get to that. But you live in South Carolina, where the auto industry is one anchor of the economy. And last time you were on a show, you talked a little bit about how people don't seem to view the South as part of the global economy or technological advancements, right? But of course it is, right? And the auto industry in particular will be affected by this Trump's tariff policy. How are people in South Carolina talking about the idea of tariffs and about Trump? Do they see him as hurting them? Do they see him as protecting American jobs? What's the take down there?
Well, the interesting thing is, I live in kind of a liberal bubble in Columbia, South Carolina, which is a blue city. So the kind of access that I have to other ways of thinking are sort of through social media and through relatives of mine, I guess, and then relatives of my husband, and then sort of like our general backgrounds. And so I come from the kind of family, they're all Republicans, they all voted for Trump, but they consider it kind of impolite to talk about politics. And so I only have one relative who's like a very outspoken MAGA supporter who posts a lot of stuff on Facebook. And interestingly, she doesn't talk much about the tariffs, even though that particular family of mine they have deep roots like in the tradition of agriculture in South Carolina. And so like my uncle, which would be this cousin's father-in-law, grew soybeans. That was a huge crop for him. And then some of my relatives still, they don't have agriculture as their primary job, but they do it on the side, and soybeans is a big part of it. And then I think that South Carolina exports like maybe 50% of their soybeans to China. And so I do know that South Carolina farmers are starting to talk about that and address it. But they seem to be very tentative about criticizing Trump because the sort of the team politics thing, you know.
It was interesting. I was reading the news coverage because Whitney was telling me, you know, check out the auto industry in South Carolina, and the news coverage, some of it is traveling this very fine line of sort of speaking very politely about the president while also trying to express concern about the tariffs.
Exactly.
And it was kind of amazing to realize, like,
It is
a journalistic dance I haven't seen before.
Because it's sort of like the idea that, you know, you're on a team, you're on the Trump team, and if you give the Democrats anything, you know, you're betraying the team. But I can tell you a little bit about like the culture of the areas where you have the auto industry and, you know, maybe some interesting things about it. Like, for example, BMW is in Greer, which is in Spartanburg County, and that's upstate. And so the place where my relatives were growing soybeans, that would be the lower part of the state. And so the upper part of the state is where you had like the big textile industry, right, in the 50s. And then it started to kind of taper off in the 70s and 80s. So it's kind of interesting when people talk about nostalgia for classic manufacturing, you know, and that's a big part of like the reason why people are supporting Trump. But in South Carolina, the textile industry was notoriously underpaid, exploitative. People who worked in textile mills often lived apart from other people in what were called mill towns. They had, people call them lint heads, white trash. You know, it was very classist. And that whole song about I owe my soul to the company store, like my mother-in-law tells me that's actually an accurate reflection. Some of my relatives were deeply in debt to the mill store, and that kind of kept them like bound to this lifestyle. And so when you're thinking about like nostalgia for some golden age of manufacturing in South Carolina, what it is textile mills and highly exploitative textile mills. So I can't really imagine anyone feeling terribly nostalgic about the majority of that. My father-in-law did work like throughout his life at Allied Chemicals, which is also like a textile mill, technically a nylon factory. But he made like enough money to support a family. He's an independent voter, and he thinks Trump's tariffs are completely illogical. They just don't match like the realities of today's economy. And so he's a pretty good representative of someone who actually made a decent living at a textile mill called Allied Chemicals. But he thinks that, you know, the current economy, you can't, and most people who speak up about this, it's like, in order to like produce manufacturing that's like contained within the United States, who is going to like start a factory suddenly to fill in trade gaps when we have a volatile political situation and they have no idea if, you know, their factory is going to be built within like say I don't even know how long it takes to build a factory, but I'm assuming it would be a while. So who's going to invest in that? So that's very unrealistic. And my father-in-law would say that. And then also he's well aware of the fact that the manufacturing in South Carolina that makes the most money now and actually makes people live a good life in the Spartanburg, Greenville area is the automobile industry. I think I already said this, I'm being repetitious, but BMW is in Greer, Volvo is in Richville, which is the Charleston area, and then Mercedes is also in the Charleston area. And so Greenville, Spartanburg, basically because of BMW, has experienced kind of an economic renaissance over the years and is a pretty well-off, like, they have a kind of booming economy. You can count the craft beer places on Main Street, for example. Won't that tell you, right? And all the restaurants and people spending money. And a lot of those people, interestingly, are Republicans. They're Republicans who, you know, enjoy the fine dining scene and definitely don't want BMW to go out of business, right? Because of these tariffs. But then at the same time, they don't want probably don't want to speak out too vehemently against the president himself, right? Because that's giving one to the other team.
So there are regional differences, and I'd be interested to know, when we're all in different places. I'm in Kansas City, Missouri. Sugi's in Minneapolis. You're in South Carolina. I wonder what the quality of small town, like small to middle-sized town life in the area around me, places that I visit, go to, have ancestors from, places like Holden, Kansas, or Goodland, Kansas, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or, in as towns in Missouri. Those towns have really experienced an economic decline, like within my lifetime, and loss of population, and their main streets are bombed out. And I drive my kid through these towns, and he's like, "What happened here?" I'm like, "Well, I think it's NAFTA, but like just a lot of people have been leaving, But it sounds like maybe the smaller towns in South Carolina are in better shape than the ones out here.
I mean, it depends on the region, right? Because like Greenville and Spartanburg area, that whole area, those, they're not like, Greenville is not a small town, it's more of a small city.
Right.
Yeah, but then there are like the town that my relatives are from is Clarendon County, and it's completely like pretty much a ghost town. Younger people aren't really staying there anymore. And it used to be a primarily agricultural region, but the people who still grow stuff there, like soybeans, are still like one of the focus, one of the main crops. And like I said, that relies on like exports to China to work. And then some of the smaller towns around South Carolina, they have like one of the, like some of the things that they rely on economically are like Amazon fulfillment centers have really been a big thing in South Carolina. There are like 10 of them. And so like you'll go to your average small town. Like, for example, my husband actually owns some land in Swansea, South Carolina, which is about 40 minutes away from where we live in Columbia, 35. And it's pretty much like they have a Hardee's, which is the southern version of a McDonald's. They have a couple of diners.
Oh, yeah, I know the Hardee's.
And a really like kind of completely dead main street. And I think it used to be primarily like an agricultural region. And then there's like dollar stores, Dollar General, maybe one grocery store, and then there's an Amazon fulfillment center close enough by, and that has become a big employer for that region.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like here, for the past couple of years, I have sometimes taught at a summer writing institute run by the University of Michigan. And so then I drive from Minnesota through the UP and to Camp Michigania. And on this drive, I see lots of towns that would kind of fall into the category that Whitney's talking about. Or in Iowa, you can see this too. I think actually, I'm trying to remember, like maybe the Dakotas as well. Like when you are, because I mean, I feel like on road trips in the Midwest, this is the feeling that Whitney is describing of kind of arriving in this town. What happened? Is one that I feel like I've had a lot. And of course, I grew up on the East Coast. I didn't grow up in one of these towns, so I don't have a sense of that arc. But I've been struck by how national political commentators, most of whom are based on the coast, fail to acknowledge how and why tariffs might even just like kind of emotionally be appealing to people who live in the middle of the country in these small towns, places that used to be supported by different kinds of jobs like the ones that you outlined. So we want to play some clips here for you and for our listeners. These are clips from podcasts that Whitney
that I listened to. But this is an exchange from the show Fast Politics, a podcast and a YouTube show with Molly Jong-Fast, and she has this guest on, David Sirota, who's an editor, who was an advisor to Bernie Sanders in 2020.
So the point is that the Democrats have a really good argument to make that these tariffs are going to harm the working class and America in general. Now, one caveat. I think if the Democrats take that to its extreme and say all industrial policy, all tariffs are bad, that the NAFTA trade paradigm and the China free trade paradigm, all of that is good, then I think they walk into a trap that Trump wants them to walk into. And I think there's evidence that parts of the party don't really understand the trap that Trump is trying to lay for them.
First, I want to just go back to what you were saying. 70% of Americans believe that tariffs are going to be bad for the economy on the short term. You don't get 70% of Americans to agree on anything. Those are incredible numbers. And I think that should be sort of the foundation of all of this. But the thing that I think will likely do the best for the opposition party, which Democrats need to be, is the haphazardness and the way that none of this has been thought out, which is what right. So, like, for example, and I want to get into this, the reshoring manufacturing is like one of the goals here, right? Reshoring manufacturing. But you can't reshore manufacturing just by making things more expensive. Chips and Science had a goal of reshoring manufacturing, really, like reshoring these high-paying manufacturing jobs, which are chips. A chips assembly line is a much better job than a sneakers assembly line. And that was the thinking here. But because they could not articulate it, it got lost. And so now here we have Trump trying to do the same thing, but because there's never any sort of thinking behind anything, we're here instead.
That's a really good point. The Biden administration, it got the policy actually right. That Biden used targeted tariffs on specific industries as part of a coordinated industrial policy.
So there are a couple interesting things about this discussion, which I thought was pretty good, actually, that bother me, which is that, like, Biden did this thing correctly, and then the Democrats never talk about it. What the fuck? Why did we let that happen?
Yeah, it is. They don't talk about a lot of the things that he's done, like infrastructure stuff and all of that. Things that would appeal to the very people who are feeling this nostalgia for like the older days of manufacturing. Yeah, that's true. I mean, and I think that most Americans would be interested in, a lot of Americans would be interested in targeted tariffs, but they're just very confused by the rapidity and seemingly random nature of the ones that are happening now.
I mean, I think it's sort of like you were saying about in terms of time. Yeah, it's just the way that I think the Democrats are they're terrible at talking about infrastructure. We really need infrastructure, as we're now learning, as it is all getting, as the Trump administration is breaking so much of it. Many of it, which was already in terrible shape anyway. So,
wait, I want to also say before we do this next clip, like the other thing, the reason Democrats, I think, and I'd be interested to know what both of you think about this, don't talk about this, and that Trump does. Trump will say, like, have you been to small towns in Pennsylvania? Have you seen what's happened there? It's devastating. These towns have been destroyed, and we are going to take it back and fix it, right? And Democrats never show any anger at all about loss of jobs and economic devastation in small towns.
So they're not like appealing to like the emotions of the people.
Yeah, because they don't know. Molly Jong-Fast has never been to a small town that's lost manufacturing.
Yeah, well, I
grew up in New York, she doesn't know anything about that. She can't speak emotionally about it.
Well, locally here, the only politician that I've heard talking about the tariffs in any kind of passionate way is James Clyburn, who's the representative from the 6th District in South Carolina. But the way things are divided up here, he's like a black man who's reelected every time and has been there for a long time. And then you have like Joe Wilson, who's like a big Trump supporter. And so basically anyone who's a Republican voter would probably just dismiss Clyburn before they even listen to a word that comes out of his mouth. But he was actually talking about soybean exports and what the tariffs are going to do to the auto industry in a kind of nuts and bolts way in some town halls and a few interviews. But like I said, I'm not sure if he would be reaching like the people who need to hear it most, maybe in South Carolina.
I guess I'm saying like the Democrats can't just say that Trump's plan to do tariffs is stupid.
Oh yeah.
They have to offer something else. Like what the fuck are you going to do to help out the people here? And they don't ever talk about that.
And then they need to stick to the facts and the data instead of, Trump is like a highly, I don't know what word to use. He can be like an overwhelmingly charismatic, grotesque, weird figure to focus on like outrage on, sort of.
That's the trap.
Without
that's
like,
the trap
exactly.
That Simona's talking about, to say, like, to get Democrats suddenly defending free trade and talking about how great free trade is and it's a wonderful thing. And the people that he is talking to do not believe that, right? They're not going to buy an NYU professor like Scott Galloway telling them how great free trade is, which is another person who's out right now.
So are you also talking about the tendency to just for Democrats to call Trump stupid?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. And so I guess kind of the parallel thing that I'm have been frustrated by recently is not just calling Trump stupid, but calling Trump voters stupid. So a lot of times on social media, I'll have a friend, you know, that will share an article about something that Trump has done that is harmful. It could be involving the tariffs or NIH grants or, you know, like ICE or anything. And then they'll basically say something like, you caused this. Any Trump voters, you know, you created this. You're basically idiots. And so I'm wondering, like, what are you trying to accomplish by basically sharing an article that has some information and then calling the people who need to like receive that information idiots? And so I'm just trying to think like, well, what is a new way for you to like open up a discussion that is critical of Trump policies in a way that does not call Trump and by extension his followers stupid in a way that's going to alienate them.
It's interesting because you mentioned Clyburn and the fact that you know, people wouldn't necessarily listen to him maybe because of who he is, and I'm just trying to think of like who are the elected representatives who are Democrats who are from small towns, like who are the politicians, like when I think about who are the Democrats who get me riled up, I'm like Adam Schiff. When Adam Schiff gives like an impassioned speech, I'm like, yeah, Adam Schiff. You know, like Chris Murphy. Chris Murphy is from Connecticut. Like I was born in Connecticut. Like when he says scathing things, I'm like, that's my brand of scathing. So who are the politicians?
Well, what I think also that politicians around here could do is that, so Nikki Haley, you know, ran against Trump in the primaries.
Yes.
And she was anti-tariff, right? I'm pretty sure. And I think maybe 40% of South Carolinians voted for her. So another thing that politicians could do is you could actually quote Republican politicians and their views on tariffs, like to the Republicans. And then, you know, that's going to be more persuasive than quoting a Democrat that they're going to automatically write off.
And just be for some. I mean, the problem that Sugi's talking about is like that all the Democratic leadership is all coastal.
You mean they're all like kind of unpassionate, and
even if they were passionate to know or care anything about the Midwest or the South.
Let me rephrase that: impassionate.
Yeah, like I mean, I guess like we need like someone who's like evangelical about this, right? And we need someone who's a Democrat, and we like, right? If we're saying that people can't listen to James Clyburn, like I don't know.
Yeah, and you know, I watched some clips of him, and he is very like persuasive. But then I'm saying I just don't know how many people he's reaching, because when I was
speaking about farming.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I got in your way.
When I was growing up and I was like a teenager, my Republican relatives, they would talk about Clyburn and they just dismissed him as like the people that the Black people in the area voted for, you know, just wholesale. Like, and so those people are not going to listen to him, even though he's, as far as I can tell, doing a great job of talking about the specifics of what's happening economically with the auto, could happen economically. Or is happening, I guess, with the soybean exports and the international automobile industry in South Carolina.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen him speak.
I mean, I think Democrats should do something like. Go ahead.
Sorry, you started before.
I'm going to get this point in eventually, but you guys go right ahead.
3, 2, 1. So I haven't seen Clyburn speak that much, but when I have seen him speak, he has been really persuasive. So I hope that sort of like an older generation racism or dismissal of him is replaced by a younger generation's openness to someone who I think is really persuasive and interesting.
Yeah, and then I'm not sure how widespread it is. He's having town halls. Like some of the clips I looked at were from town halls, and then there were a few interviews. So I have no idea how like widely spread this would be like disseminated. But you know, the other politicians, main ones in the, like McMaster was just appointed to some 10-person governor's council by Trump. That's our governor. So he's not going to be saying anything against Trump, right? And then Joe Wilson, as far as I know, he's the one who's famous for saying you lied to Obama. Remember that?
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
I do.
So he's not going to be, but so my suspicion is that Republicans who are involved in agriculture and who have jobs at Amazon fulfillment centers or auto plants like BMW, Volvo, or Mercedes are worried about the tariffs, and they need to like hear criticisms of it. But then at the same time, they're highly polarized when it comes to politics. I mean, Republicans in the South almost see liberals as some kind of like, they see them as sinful communists.
Well, let's play a clip that does not do anything to just help dispel that idea from people that I like. I mean, these are Democratic commentators that I listen to, respect, and believe in, right? but I just think they're doing a bad job of talking about this issue. Okay, so this is Tim Miller, who I really think is great, on the Bulwark podcast, which is an anti-Trump sort of ex-conservatives. Well, they're still conservatives, don't like Trump podcast. And they have this guest, Justin Wolfers, on, who's an Australian professor at the University of Michigan, talking about the cooperation that's great about, global economics and globalization. Okay, here's the clip.
I want to rehearse the answer for your viewers so that they know how to yell when it comes up in their conversations.
Yeah, okay.
So trade, the big intellectual mistake people make is they think trade is about competition, that it's a fixed pie, and if I win, you lose. That's not true. The beauty of economics and of international trade is my field studies cooperation. We study how we can make each other better off. I looked at my dinner plate last night. It had salmon that some Norwegian farmer had decided I might want to eat. It had quinoa, which proves I'm a liberal, but some Peruvian farmer.
Look at you, fancy pants, with your quinoa. Do you have some kale? Do you have some arugula?
Of course we had arugula. That was a religious sacrifice at the beginning of the meal. We lit it up, actually, and said 3 Hail Obamas. So I had quinoa. A very nice gentleman in Peru thought I might want quinoa. There was some dill that went with my salmon because I am fancy.
Mm-hmm.
Look, when it's in season, I buy it from America. When it's not in season, rather than go without, it comes in from Israel. My dinner plate was it was the product of so much beautiful cooperation from people around the world who want me to eat well and healthy and balanced, and I am so grateful to them.
Okay, that's really something. Like, quinoa is for liberals, apparently, except for this Republican is delighting in it. He thinks that workers overseas care about whether he eats a healthy and balanced meal. I am 100% sure they don't. They probably care about making a living. I like my salmon, but I feel like that argument probably rings hollow to someone in, say, Kansas, who's lost their job to a worker overseas. So is this view of
or Alaska, by the way, where I used to work in the fishing industry, and it would be great if people would buy Alaskan salmon instead of Norwegian salmon in a lot of ways, at least according to an Alaska fisherman who voted for Trump,
Well, so is this view of free trade, is this like a kind of elitism?
So do you think he would have been more persuasive if he was talking about a dinner plate that would appeal to a wider range of Americans? Or is he not looking?
It's just like unconvincing, I mean, like, why would anybody?
I guess he couldn't fake it.
Like, if you were like, I got my steak from Japan, I got my potatoes.
Like, globalization is good for the elites. It's good for us. It's good for the cities, right? But if you look, we also have a map that we'll connect to in the show notes about like where people have left in the last 20 years, right? And it's all the areas that we're talking about. Like people it's not just I don't just drive through these towns. I have friends who are from small towns, who have families who are still there, right? Who have watched these towns die over 20 years. And they're like, I don't think getting good salmon from Norway is going to help our town come back, And what Democrats could be saying is like, we want to break up corporate farming. Why not say that? That would be helpful.
Yeah, that's true. And then I even have relatives who had their farms bought out by international conglomerates, and they still got to run their farms. But this was a while back. Yeah, but I think that the whole food price thing would resonate with many people in poor towns. But I guess that wouldn't be the person who could voice that. And then everybody's addicted to coffee, and coffee prices could be affected. It's a major drug that everybody in the United States seems to be addicted to. So,
I mean, I do think, in realistic ways, if prices go up, people will be pissed off and it will be bad for Trump. But the Democrats are hoping that that's happened. They're not like offering some other plan. That's what's freaking me out.
Well, I did want to say also, though, that the relative that I was talking about who lives in the small town, who is the one who is like the only one who is impolite enough to voice MAGA views. Because, like I said, that's a big thing in the South. Voicing political views, especially in a cantankerous way, is considered rude. And so, like, if you go to a family dinner or something and you try to discuss something, usually someone from the older generation, a woman, will, like, politely try to shut the conversation down because they don't want, like, anything out of control to happen at their social event. But this particular cousin is kind of a part of a new it's an interesting, like, she is a vegan MAGA person who's like really into RFK, and she's really into quinoa and arugula and all of that. And so it's kind of a trend that I have been following for a while, where the whole kind of yoga wellness movement, like half of it has moved rightward after COVID, and so like weirdly, I don't know, she might be somewhat put off by the elitism of the guy's tone, but the idea that something like quinoa would be alien to someone who lives in a small town in South Carolina is kind of condescending also. Does that make sense?
Fair enough.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So,
I mean, and this is in so much of your work, like, right? And you talked about this the last time you were on the show, sort of like people's notions of people in the South as like provincial or parochial, or that their worlds are smaller in some way, like technology went everywhere but the South. No, not the case. Or like globalization went everywhere but the South. Also not the case. And, you were talking before about Amazon fulfillment centers, and in one of the stories in Hellions, you have a character who's delivering stuff, and I don't think you say that it's an Amazon worker, but given what I see every day in my neighborhood, that was how I imagined it. Kind of someone driving around delivering all of these things made elsewhere. And one of the things I love about this story, which is called Another Frequency, is that like I love like a good descriptive list, like lots of objects. And this character is just like, she's delivering just all sorts of stuff. And then there are these reactions of the people who are sort of it just made me think about like how swiftly I buy things without thinking online. And I don't think about where they're made. I don't think about where they come from. I don't really I should be thinking about all these things. I should be thinking about who delivers them. They're University of Minnesota students who are working in Amazon warehouses. Anyway, in Another Frequency, we want to pivot to talk about your fiction. This story, the protagonist Viv is delivering all of these things that are made elsewhere, and she listens to music while she drives, and she stumbles onto a frequency that kind of calls to her, and it draws her into the woods when she tries to follow it. And I wonder if you would read from that story for us.
Sure. Yeah. You wanted me to read the section where it's a nice list of things. Yeah. I kind of envisioned her as like some equivalent of like a UPS driver.
Okay.
But of course the UPS drivers would be delivering a lot of Amazon in my neighborhood, at least. Like most of it comes from. Okay. So Viv delivered digital picture frames and carry-on luggage, waterproof cameras and pop-up play tunnels, chargeable miniature Land Rovers and cashmere throws. She worked through lunch, wolfing down a sandwich after 1 o'clock. The voice surfaced late that afternoon during a fresh squall, hypnotic, deep, vaguely feminine. Welcome to dim shapes. Imagine me at the top of a fire tower, enveloped in a cloud. Imagine me in a woodland hillock, tucked into a rusted camper, or floating along the river on a barge. I'm nowhere, I'm everywhere. Viv pulled to the roadside. The first sound she heard seemed to come from the woods, a canine howling, coyotes, feral dogs, wolves, that lapsed into women keening, a rhythmic, mournful, collective wail, so intense Viv couldn't fathom how it came from her old portable radio with the missing battery plate, the AAs secured with black electrical tape. The lamentation quickened, shifting to chanting, and then morphed into percussion, primal and spare. She imagined a whale skeleton on a beach, a woman dressed in deerskins, tapping the ribcage with bone mallets. She thought she could hear the ocean. A mechanical hum in the background thickened and thinned. An exquisite cello melody emerged and faded away. And then an intimate voice, masculine baritone, sang in a language she didn't understand. Nestled into this language was another language, one she thought she knew. Kanana, a woman, sang Kimjo. Viv heard a knock on the window, looked up, saw rain-blurred woods. Kanana, the woman sang, come into the trees. I'm a lunatic, Viv whispered as she opened her door, a child of the moon. She got out of her truck and stood in the drizzle, listening. Women sang in the forest, a ravishing harmony that reminded her of early radio quartets, medieval masses, bacchantes romping on the green hill. Probably Christmas carolers, she thought, singing in Latin. She pictured them on the porch of a house nestled into the woods. Viv slipped through the wet brush into old-growth forests that would soon be raised for houses, strip malls, high-end chain restaurants. She touched the wet, mossy bark of a live oak, smelled some winter flower, devilwood perhaps, the wild cousin of Tariff. She followed the music into darkness untouched by street lamps. Though she didn't find a cabin, she discovered a clearing, a trace of melody still echoing there. But the women were gone. Viv stood still, listening to the drizzle, to the wind whipping through dead leaves. She remembered her DIAD or DIAD. That's the electronic device that charts deliveries. Her deliveries, her little radio with the worn plastic dial. She was lost, she realized, but she had her phone in her pocket. She had GPS, over 75 navigation satellites in orbit, helping people find their way. Josh had once informed her that there were over 2,000 satellites circling the Earth, the exosphere crammed with them, the air whirring with a zillion invisible signals.
Thank you so much. I love that story, that passage in particular. Can you talk about how Viv's working life matters to the feeling you were trying to capture with that story?
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like, not to be pretentious, but so when you're doing a dull, repetitive task like delivering things, you just suffer from classic Marxist alienation. And by using that term, I'm definitely going to alienate people who might be listening. But that sense of alienation where you're disconnected from your work. But I feel like it doesn't have to be like a blue-collar job. It could be any boring office job or data processing job or something like that, where you just don't have any emotional engagement whatsoever with the job and you're just doing it. And then to add to that alienation with the repetitive tasks and no emotional connection to the work, she's like delivering stuff from like the really fast, economy, a lot of sort of disposable items. It's Christmas season. People are getting really nervous about what she calls their Christmas arsenals loaded and locked, that onrush of consumerism that happens right before Christmas. But all of the characters in my book yearn for something, transcendent. And the thing that helped her get through her job on a daily basis was her connection to music. So she would listen to music all day while driving around. And then one day, the music just doesn't feel emotionally viable to her anymore. It's the way she describes it. It goes dead like a dead tooth, right? You can't feel it anymore. And so she gets distressed and she listens to all this different music. And then finally she discovers a pirate radio station, which takes her into this very weird mode where she doesn't know where the voices and the songs are coming from. And it kind of takes her into some like weird primordial occult quest for something that leads her actually into rivers and woods and that sort of thing. And so I feel like a big part of that story would be the alienation that sort of leads her into that quest. And then, of course, it would be like a light criticism, like nothing profoundly satirical or anything, of the consumer economy, where people get 1,000 trivial things delivered to them on a daily basis that they order on Amazon and have 2-day delivery or whatever, and all of that. So
this idea of alienation that you're talking about also sort of underlies a lot of the discussion that's been going on around tariffs, because like my liberal channels will make fun of Fox. That's one thing they do, is like play clips from Fox and then make fun of them. And you'll have people on Fox saying like, when Trump said, well, maybe girls could only have 2 dolls instead of 30, right? And they'll make fun of that as an absurd. But there's something true about the fact that like consumerism is not spiritual. It's not saving us. There's something empty about just getting dolls, right? Just getting toys, right? Mm-hmm. There's something real there that we're missing, that I feel like you're trying to get at in this story.
Yeah, I mean, all the characters in the book are basically pining for something beyond. And they do come from different class backgrounds. And I think it is important to note that anyone from the middle class and down can feel this. Well, it's not even class-based, actually, because I don't know. Have y'all read Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber or heard of it? But he writes about all of the like weird, meaningless jobs that are produced by bureaucracies. These jobs where like people will go to work and they don't even really understand what they're doing or what their job is. It's sort of like maybe television series like The Office or Severance would evoke that feeling of alienation and weirdness. And so I don't know, a lot of people feel like that, and they might try to fill up the emptiness with consumerism and buying things, but that doesn't really work. I don't know where I was going with that. I kind of got off topic.
Well, at the same time, the other thing I noticed about the book, which I really enjoyed, was a lot of the characters, they aren't interested in politics or any of the things we're talking about right now, at least not in the surface way that we're discussing it. The main character in the story, Hellion, loves her Hellcat, cares about exploring the swamp, is raising an alligator. Could you talk about that story and that character? I mean, how would a progressive talk to someone like her?
Well, she would actually be a good target because she is developing a sort of class consciousness in that story, right? She's like a Hellion girl that people would have called a tomboy back in my day, a stubborn cuss who won't conform to the gender ideal. And she drives a go-kart around, has a BB gun, and hangs out with a bunch of Hellion boys. And then her cousin from Aiken, South Carolina, which is kind of a larger town than Davis Station, which is where she lives, comes, and it sort of like brings out her aspirational tendencies. But she had those to begin with. Like, she has an aunt in town who lets her use her library, and she knows she's actually saving up for college, even though she knows that she'll probably never reach that level. And then her father is an unemployed farmer, and then her mother is a woman who has a medical job where she does the night shift and performs repetitive kind of bleak tasks all the time. And then they have this wonky schedule. So I feel like even though Butter's not talking about politics specifically, she's got a very keen sense of class consciousness. And so then when her cousin, who is clearly middle class, comes to visit and stay for a week, she is really interested in his world as a sort of alien world, and her aspirational tendencies come out, and she wants to go to college and somehow escape this world that she's stuck in. But at the same time, there's a magical part of her world too that is beyond the class status, beyond her class status, and that involves the weird quasi-magical swamp and this creature that lives there called the swamp ape, and all of the kind of adventurous and interesting things about her life that we might assume that a rural person does not have access to, the sense of wonder or whatever. So I don't know. I mean, I feel like this character, my childhood, I grew up in the rural South Carolina. So there are a lot of things about her character that I relate to personally. So I feel like if a progressive person wanted to talk to her about politics, that the main thing that they would want to do is not condescend and assume that she didn't have a very rich personal life and even a feel for mystical things and otherworldly things, and which a lot of the characters in the book, Viv is driving a UPS truck. She's alienated from her job, but she's chasing after this very strange music that just takes her to another place. So I don't know. I feel like in a way, Butter is actually political. Does that make sense?
Yeah, what you're saying reminds me of the way that Democrats make fun of RFK or the Maha people, or they have to understand. I think the Democrats are forgetting that the people in the areas that they view as benighted are fully human and alive to mystery and magic and all that stuff, and just saying you're dumb is not helpful. It's not working as a political strategy right now.
Yeah, and then also, like I said, my main problem with just friends on Facebook posting political articles is that they always have to get in a dig at how dumb Republican voters are. And I don't think that is the best way to make people who might be on the fence start thinking, or, maybe get away from Donald Trump and MAGA. And then, like I said, the whole really strange realm is where MAGA meets yoga. It's there's a whole podcast called Conspirituality that talks about this stuff. And their little logo used to be, I didn't mean to sound condescending, little logo. Their logo used to be a person in a MAGA hat meditating. That's just a whole realm. And actually, let's see, do you know who Naomi Klein is, who wrote that book Doppelganger? So Naomi Klein is a progressive. She's beloved and well known, and she's always been mixed up with Naomi Wolf, she was a pretty famous third wave feminist who kind of went to the dark side, right? As people would see it. She ended up being basically a MAGA person who was claiming that vaccines were contaminating the water supply and vaccinated and unvaccinated people should have separate sewer systems, right? So instead of Naomi Klein condescending about Naomi Wolf, she kind of investigates the eerie parallel world in terms of her connection to her, if that makes any sense. But there's an interesting chapter. Her husband was a Canadian politician and he was going door to door. She was going door to door for him. And she would encounter someone who looked like a yoga hippie mom. And she would expect them to be, a progressive, and then it would turn out that they were actually right wing, and that's happening more and more today. And then it's crossing over the other way as well. Like I said, I used to my family would make fun of me for being a vegetarian, like in my college years and grad student days, and then now my cousin, who's the most outspoken MAGA supporter, is a vegan, and she really loves RFK, and she's really tapped into all kinds of sort of wellness stuff, but she's also like very Christian, so she's not really into the yoga meditation side of it. But
well, this is maybe a whole other episode, but there is like there's a history of this, right? There were Nazis who were interested in this kind of wellness.
Exactly.
Yeah. And right, there is like a whole Christian movement to sort of have like yoga, but without Hinduism. So
we were supposed to go the whole episode without mentioning Nazis, Sugi. That was part of the deal. Come on.
I didn't sign that.
Well, you can bleep that out.
But I think that like in your stories there are, and also like in the South and the Midwest there are progressives. The progressives in your stories are, shall we say, somewhat different. I'm thinking of the wild professor from your story, Earl King. I don't know,
but actually,
I will say that Whitney wrote this question and identified the professor as a progressive. I didn't.
But Viv and her wife would be progressives. Just because you drive a UPS truck doesn't mean you can't be a progressive, right?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I think it's the Earl King where
and then that's kind of what do you want me to say about that?
Well, I'm curious about like how you, because like I was looking in the back about like the notes of where, right, even the notion of like an Earl King comes from, which is, I recall, I'll have to flip to the back here. But, if you would just talk a little bit about
it's like a German mythology thing, and so it's like some figure that rides around on a horse collecting children, basically. And so like there's a poem by Goethe about the Earl King, but where my story really is more tuned in with Angela Carter's version. So Angela Carter was the second wave feminist who kind of really started that whole thing of retelling fairy tales in her famous book, The Bloody Chamber. And so in her story, the Earl King, it's like a weird magical man in the woods who collects girls and turns them into birds and then keeps them in a cage. And then at the end of the story, the main character frees all the birds. It's a glorious, lovely ending. And so basically what I was trying to convey is I'm a Gen X person, and I grew up, my college era consisted of during my college era, that actually sounded, bleep that out. Let me start over. When I was in college and grad school, it was not uncommon for young women to date professors. This is before the Me Too movement. And a lot of professors had this idea that they could just like sort of pluck undergraduates and graduate students like pieces of succulent fruit that they could just, collect because they're powerful guys who can seduce women with their amazing knowledge. And so this never happened to me personally, but I do remember hanging out in the dorm hall, and this will really date it for you. We're all like smoking cigarettes in the hall of the dorm, right? And there's like a cloud of smoke, like fog. This is in South Carolina. And one of the girls the young women on the hall was dating an art professor, and she would just tell us all about the art professor. And she kind of presented him as this this really fancy man. And my thought was like, why are you dating this guy? Like, what is the magic? I didn't see it at all. And so this story is about like an older professor kind of wooing a younger woman with a mystique that kind of taps into poetry and humanities lore and his power as a professor. And then she ends up basically, actually one critic said, he passes druidic knowledge on to young women, exploiting them and maintaining his vibrancy or whatever. But it is kind of implied that he's quasi-vampiric and kind of relies on like a constant stream of seduction, like seducing young women to sort of retain his vitality. And then the story is about the young woman, but sort of becoming aware that she's got her own power, and then she like detaches herself from him at the end.
Who was the upstate New York Kirsten Gillibrand? I was like, this is not a story that Kirsten Gillibrand would have written, right? This is a way of thinking about that issue that I thought was much more complex and interesting, and like it isn't. I mean, it may relate to concepts of the Me Too movement, but it felt to me much deeper and more complicated than that. So
yeah, I mean, I definitely like Like, are you saying that it would almost be taboo in certain circles to even admit that the student could be attracted to the professor, even if he is sort of tricking her with a kind of false sorcery or something?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I see what you mean. Yeah. And then this really happened a lot whenever I was like in college. And so I was just conveying what it was like. But the young woman does, eventually see through certain illusions and come out with her own thing going on at the end.
No doubt.
But
I thought it was a really good story also.
Yeah, I like that story too.
It's a beautiful story.
But it's interesting to think that it might be taboo.
I think a lot, but yeah, I mean, I think it probably still is. I think that, like, for me, the notion of like how this story sort of connects to some of what we're talking about is like the transformations the two of them go through, which are so like they vary in their speed, they vary in their pleasure, and she finally sort of breaks out of it. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess I didn't think of him as a progressive figure in part because of the Me Too thing that you're mentioning. And I think it was, yeah, I mean, I remember being a graduate student and sort of, or even an undergrad and sort of seeing that vibe everywhere, which I think these days is.
And then when I actually spoke to a group of students not long ago, and I was explaining that to them because it was a different time, and they seemed almost like incredulous, like they were just confused and like, really, that happened. It's like, yeah. And then I've also read from that story before in different settings, and sometimes people laugh at the intro because they're like, no, I mean, there are some funny moments, right? Because like the professor is ridiculously romantic, right? It's absurd. It's over the top. And then other people are kind of horrified by it because they're thinking, oh my God, this person's being like abused, but it's sort of, the truth is somewhere else there. I don't know exactly, but I like what Whitney said about it, that it's like complicated because so.
All right. Well, Julia, thank you so much for joining us for this wide-ranging conversation about tariffs and fiction. Listeners, we encourage you to pick up this terrific collection. It's called Hellions, as well as Julia's previous work, The Wild, and also the new and improved Romy Futch at your local independent bookstore. Julia, thank you.
Thank you so much.